Thank you for joining today's session on digital regulatory reporting and ORR. My name is Eleanor from ISDA. For ISDA, I cover North America trade reporting, CFTC, SEC, and Canada. And as well, I'm the DRR program lead for ISDA. In addition, I'm co-lead of GLIFE's industry working group called the Jiffy. And I'm happy to be here to discuss the use case of CDM in trade reporting today. I'll spend just 3 to 5 minutes talking about the DRR with ISDA governance, and then we'll turn to JPMorgan, who will discuss the implementation journey for DRR. And then we'll hear from RBC and South Cardinal on a project they're working on with FINOS to make DRR more widely available via the cloud. Now, many of you have already attended the previous sessions on what is CDM, so I'm not going to go into that in detail again, but just suffice to say that CDM is a standardized model for financial products, transactions, and lifecycle events. CDM is machine readable, machine executable, it's open source via FINOS, and it's across collaboration, including ISDA, ISLA, and ICMA. Now, trade reporting is an ideal use case for common domain model. Why? From an industry perspective, no one wants to be an outlier for compliance with trade reporting. That can put you in the spotlight from a regulatory standpoint for scrutiny. In addition, that might result in monetary penalties and fines. From a regulatory standpoint, regulators need data to be able to fulfill their supervisory obligations. Analyzing data efficiently and effectively allows them to affect appropriate policy making, understand systemic risks in a timely manner, and basically be able to react timely to issues in systemic risk. They can assess the data if, for instance, the data for trade reporting is going to trade repositories differently from institution to institution because they're not going to be able to aggregate the data effectively. So what is DRR? DRR is an industry mutualized initiative which uses ISDA's robust framework of working groups to agree interpretations of trade reporting rules and form best practices. The DRR turns those trade reporting rules and best practices into machine executable code. So any firm that is adopting that code will be reporting consistent with the industry interpretations of that set of trade reporting rules. The digitized data elements can be submitted to trade repositories, and you do not have to be a member to access the DRR code. You don't have to be an ISDA member to access the DRR code. It is open to all. DRR is developed and amended centrally. The DRR code is reusable for any trade reporting regulation that mandates the same requirements. What that means for implementers is that when you're implementing new rules or even amendments to rules, it can be done more quickly, more cheaply, with fewer resources. In terms of the digital regulatory reporting roadmap, ISDA is committed to developing DRR in multiple jurisdictions, as you can see here. Key point is DRR is live and it's implemented. We have developed for CFTC, GFSA, EU EMIR, and UK EMIR went live yesterday. We will be ready, and we've developed for ASIC and MOS, which will go live October 21st. And we're committed to also developing for Canada, HKMA, MIFIR for both UK and EU, and FinFrog for Switzerland, as well as SEC, when the SEC determines what they'd like to do with the safe harbor currently in place. With that, if you'd like some more additional information, we do have a website that you can go to, or you can just contact us at the email you see up there. And now I'm going to just turn to JPMorgan to take the stage to talk about their journey for implementation. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, so my name's Nick Moger. I I'm from JPMorgan. I run their regulatory technology change team across the EDG business, which caters for all asset classes of derivatives. We decided maybe around a year ago that CDM and DRR would be a worthwhile pursuit within the firm. As you can imagine, within a firm the size of JPMorgan, it's not that we're doing it for the whole of JPMorgan. We're doing it for the one line of business with a view to growing out strategically based on its success. So right now we're in the middle of the ASIC and MAS implementation, which goes live in 19 days. And I'm going to tell you a bit of information about our journey, how we've got to this point, how we found it. Also, some of these slides actually were not created for this presentation. They were created for internal presentations with senior stakeholders to explain the value of pivoting something like our regulatory reporting, which is obviously such a sensitive thing to decide to change. So a lot of this information has been already presented internally. So just a bit of a word salad to start with. What I'm really trying to say here is the problems, just based on my experience with firms and their experiences with regulatory reporting, the problems we face in order to get what we would call accurate, efficient regulatory reporting are not actually limited to regulatory reporting. They're actually issues with business-to-business communication in the financial world as a whole, thematically. And there's actually something I'll go into in a bit more detail where CDM solves a problem for us that we didn't intend it to by using it for regulatory reporting, which I'm going to go into a bit more detail on. So this slide, very often, very senior stakeholders will ask, why is regulatory reporting so hard? And in the end, if you explain it to someone, it doesn't sound like it's going to be very complicated, right? You have to take some data, send it to a regulator in a certain SLA, in a certain format. Having worked in the space for 15 plus years, I've seen it evolve across various jurisdictions, standards bodies coming into place to actually try and regulate the regulators. Maybe regulate's the wrong word, but influence. It's not a straightforward thing to do, especially if you work in the derivative space. But I boiled it down into two themes of where we see the issues mainly occurring. So one is how we deploy our expertise within the firm, and another is obviously going to be technology solutioning. So when it comes to regulatory reporting, the accurate regulatory reporting requires the intersection of domain-specific knowledge. So you're going to need people who understand your products, you're going to need people who understand the regulations, and you're going to need people who understand the systems. Not always do those three areas of people communicate fluidly. The multiple degrees of operational and technology separation exist between those experts and the regulatory reporting solutions, and efforts to ensure sometimes obviously as regulatory flows evolve within a firm, there'll be huge strategic efforts to try and create a consistent governance firm-wide, consistent technology solutions firm-wide. That can actually end up hampering agility in the long term as well, from a governance perspective. Then in the technology space, depending on the size of your firm and how you've evolved, you could end up with complex technology solutions that hamper agility, creating problematic translations between the source data in risk and the outbound data. You may have undertaken ambitious centralized internal data strategies, which don't really solve the underlying issue of data quality. And to achieve a single source of truth for the purposes of regulatory reporting, you need to have the creation of the data that's used for reg and the interpretation of it must be frictionless, which I'll actually explain a bit more on that in a few minutes. So these are, if I was to stand in front of someone to say, why is something going wrong or why is it so hard? It's really, this is how I could boil it down. And that's the slide before, when I'm going backwards. Okay, here we go. So the world we live in, I don't know how many of you work in the regulatory space, but this is what I would call my world, which is it's not just about, what I'm trying to put forward on this slide is it's not just about us and the regulator. There's a lot of other parties involved. There's us and our counterparties. You may be doing on behalf of reporting for your counterparties, for example. Within the firm itself, you will have obviously your legal, compliance, operations, technology, differing opinions, different people handling things like Q&As that are constantly coming from the regulators. And your counterparty will have that, and every other counterparty will have that as well. The other thing, especially more recently, you've got the standards and policy bodies that work with the regulators like CPMI, IOSCO. You've got regulatory-specific vendors like ANA-DSB providing services that allow us to meet certain parts of the regulations. And as we've always had, CCPs, venues, industry forums, and industry bodies such as ISDA. The reason I'm putting that sort of circle in here is that we all need to send similar data to each other for different purposes, whether that be matching, reg reporting, settlements, or venue transactions. Two financial institutions sending financial data to each other is nothing new. But at least in the last, my career up to now, whatever we've been building for regulatory reporting has been completely bespoke. And it's always been solve this problem, whether it be MiFID or EMIR, and solve it in a completely greenfield way. Like from scratch, you build out this reg reporting stack. You're not leveraging something which might already exist to do transaction reporting elsewhere. So that's the world we live in. Now, what does a perfect world look like? Well, in terms of, if we were to design the perfect solution, it would be low complexity. We would be in a position where we discover our own issues and we're in control of things like anomaly detection. Controls is a fairly large theme. If you've got the most accurate reg reporting in the world, but you don't have any controls, then it's, shelf life will be limited by the quality of those controls, essentially. And you could be looking at fines pretty quickly. And the adaptability and recovery, which is key. When you find an issue, how quickly can you recover from it? So these three pillars are what we say is really the pillars of an efficient regulatory reporting solution. It's got to be low complexity. You need to be in a position where issues discover themselves or you have anomaly detection. And once you find these issues, you can recover from them. So as I said, that world that I showed you earlier, every industry participant shares that world with us. So one thing, aside from the fact that we all have to be compliant with these regimes, we also share very common processes and goals. So obviously, our goal is compliance. We also, as industry participants, want to maximize interoperability between other participants at the same time, whether that be venues or client portals or any sort of B2B communication. But we're also trading the same products. We have the same engagement with ISDA. We've got the same trade management processes. Company X novating an equity swap is going to have the same concept of innovation as company Y. We're all doing these same things, but depending on where you've worked, everyone's obviously implemented these things independently. But ultimately, there'll be fungible processes there. So this is where the CDM comes in. And so how can you leverage that shared knowledge and expertise of the whole industry to achieve those common goals by leveraging common processes? And this is where CDM comes in, as I said, sorry. So the deployment of the common domain model, really, from our perspective, we had two goals. One was to, overall lower the cost of compliance, and that doesn't necessarily mean financial. But the deployment of domain expertise, which is what we talked about earlier, and lowering technology complexity. Now, there's multiple ways of explaining deployment of domain expertise, but I'm going to hopefully make that very clear in a slide that's coming up. So my advice is creating a core capability around CDM will allow you, as it is allowing us, to lower the cost of compliance through the use of digital regulatory reporting, increase industry operability through CDM's alternate use cases, which you'll find out more about in other sessions, and open new values for client value creation, new avenues for client value creation. It's not very often that you can go in front of senior stakeholders and say that a regulatory reporting solution will actually add value back to the business. It's not known as as more of a value subtractor than a value addition in most cases. But this is the world we're in at the moment, and I'll explain a bit more about that. This next slide, I won't dwell on too much. This is really an explanation of what is CDM. It can be, I mean, CDM is many things. It's a platform. It's also a collection of governance, like Eleanor was explaining through ISDA and various other bodies. It has multiple use cases, but I think the word platform is really the best way to describe it. It's a platform you can do something with to, for CDM at least. You can model trades and processes in a stateful manner to achieve some other goal, whether it be digital regulatory reporting, collateral management, clearing processes. You could model an entire workflow for pre-trade to post-trade using CDM. It's limitless, essentially. And obviously, the more you embed it or implement it, the more native you will be to its use cases. So, for example, if I was building a risk management system or at least a workflow from scratch using CDM, then the use cases like DRR, et cetera, would just almost be like plugins. Whereas, obviously, we weren't able to do that in a firm the size of JPMorgan. So we're creating CDM transiently, which means we're, for a given trade event, we'll translate that into CDM and then use it and store it. But depending on what avenues you've got for implementation, you can take several approaches there. So, as I say, I won't dwell on this slide too much. Okay, so if you were asked to benchmark the effectiveness of your regulatory reporting, hopefully some of you do regulatory reporting or are involved in it, like how would you? This is just a thought question. Like how would you go about benchmarking your effectiveness against the industry? Now, one obvious way is if you knew how much everyone was spending on their budget for regulatory reporting, you minus how much they've been fined, you get to a number, and you could, in theory, measure people on that. But does that actually measure the effectiveness, or does it just mean that you've not been in the crosshairs of the regulator, or you have a smaller number of products? So we were thinking this through internally because we actually wanted to perform an exercise where we, used some KPIs to sort of measure the effectiveness of the operational flows. Now, you may not agree with this, but one or many of you have probably had a regulatory query before where the regulator contacts you as a firm, asks a question, and you have to respond within a certain amount of time. One thing I've witnessed is how quickly can you as a firm respond to that regulatory query, and how many teams have to be consulted before you get to the answer that they're expecting? How many email trails have you seen that have been bounced through X number of teams, Y weeks, in order to get an answer where actually there's probably one person that does know the answer, but it takes a very long time to get through the layers, etc. And I think that is basically the way of measuring, at least for us it was, the effectiveness of our operational deployment with regulatory reporting. How many groups are required to respond to the query? How long does it take? How much resource is utilized in that whole email that's being bounced around before it finally gets to the gatekeepers, if you like, that communicate with the regulators, who actually are the people who, no offense to them, understand the least about the flows, the technology, the products. The actual people that talk to the regulators are usually very far distance from technology, operations, everything else, but very close to legal. So why is that a problem? Well, okay, so let's say you had a specific question on equity OTC options. Trading and the business were the people who would potentially know the answer, but if you present the question to them in the context of the way regulatory reporting is formatted, they'll be like, I don't understand this data. They'll see things with Greeks and be like, oh, this is the delta, the gamma, whatever. They won't know what I can't think of a field off the top of my head, but leg 1, direction 2, whatever we want to call it. It's a different language to them. Like, yes, they're product experts, but someone has to take the regulatory templates back, relate that to something they're more familiar with, and that's where you get these layers of noise before you actually get to the final answer. Now, the overall process of regulatory reporting, successful regulatory reporting and managing a control framework around it requires seamless intersection of these domains. If these domains are constantly bouncing around when it comes to these queries or any other part of control, then you've got problems. And the larger the firm, the bigger those problems can become, because you've got not only individual lines of business, you then start going horizontally, and it can escalate pretty rapidly. So where does digital regulatory, I've made a bit of a jump here, sorry. So I'm now talking about digital regulatory reporting, which is a use case that sits on top of CDM. So how does that impact the operational overhead? So as I mentioned earlier, reg reporting is not traditionally seen as a value creation opportunity for a business. It's a necessary function to ensure regulatory compliance. Like, I'm not saying firms don't want to do it. Everyone has to do it by law, but they want to obviously do it as cheaply and efficiently as possible while maintaining compliance. Be careful of the language. Obviously, they don't. You want to be doing what you need to be compliant and no more. It is essentially what you see as the approach. Having worked in that space, it's not been the most, up until recently, innovative space in my career, but we've tried to push the boundaries in certain areas, and with CDM, it's given us an opportunity to now weirdly be at the forefront of post-trade technology, which we'll go into in a bit more detail. But even so, when things go wrong, the business are very interested in what the problem was, why is regulatory reporting so hard, and they're the ones who ultimately pay the fines. So the business has a vested interest in regulatory reporting one way or the other. Now, fine avoidance is often looked at as, well, it's often overlooked as a source of value. I mean, ultimately for a firm to say, well, we haven't been fined, you could take the average fine across all other dealers and then say, well, technically we've saved this much by being compliant. Is something that's not really done. The cost of compliance is really measured in the people and technology spend associated with reg reporting flows. So is it possible to do it cheaper, but also to do it better? Well, what if the core component of regulatory reporting was also a value creator for the business, which is where CDM comes in? Now, it turns out the alternate use cases for CDM have been, at least for us, burning issues over the years, such as derivative matching, documentation, various other, downstream communication of derivatives has always been a complex topic across multiple lines of business. So when CDM came along and the alternate use cases with it, there was a lot of interest for the non-regulatory use cases, which we got involved with. But for the first time, at least in my career in reg, we were able to offer something which was a bespoke regulatory reporting solution, which could end up adding value to the business, which is where I'm coming from with this. So if you have to sell or pitch CDM internally, it's a lot more palatable because there's a lot more going on with it than what you'll be able to achieve with DRR. DRR is a great use case or showcase for what you can do with CDM, but once you've built it, you're ready to adopt any of the other, or at least ready to adapt to any of the other use cases as well. So once you've built CDM, it essentially allows you to, or integrated rather than built, it essentially allows you to model your products and events down to the lowest level of granularity within your risk management systems or workflows. Having myself had experience with 2 separate risk management systems, it is very, very flexible. It's very adaptable to, it's not rigid in how you map products and events and state transitions. I don't get too technical, but there's a lot of flex in, you can tell a lot of thought has gone into the design because it can be done at various levels of granularity in various ways. There's a lot of flexibility there. Now, what actually happens with CDM is when the business has a vested interest in mapping products to CDM, which we do, and we've got our various lines of business now involved with the product mapping. All of a sudden, you've got your business engaged in the thing that's actually going to be driving the regulatory reporting, which is one of the problems I mentioned earlier, is that technology are not close to the business from a regulatory reporting perspective, and vice versa. But here, the very technology that they're interested in implementing is exactly the solution that will end up being the regulatory reporting that goes out the door. So we can talk to the business in CDM terms from a regulatory perspective, and they will understand the questions, if that makes sense. Because it's just a few click-throughs in the Rosetta platform to see how you get from CDM to a certain regulatory rule, to a certain regulatory field, or a regulatory validation. That single store of lineage is what is very powerful. So as you've heard, digital regulatory reporting, it's all human readable. I mean, it's a new way of interacting with rules. It's much better than templates and CSVs, and it's a new visual interaction, which is actually very refreshing. That's one of the first things you notice about using the Rosetta platform is, this is a cool way of understanding how data gets from A to B, what journey it goes through. And there's a lot going on with Rosetta, which I'd recommend you take a look at. But it's like a living, breathing. One thing we certainly noticed is the less need for documentation. I'm not saying we don't write any documentation, but the whole Rosetta platform is almost a living spec, if you like, because once you've taken a cut of your code, you've got a cut of that Rosetta, that version of CDM. It's a living document of all of the rules and regulatory reporting functions that are in there. You don't need to re-document it yourself. So anyway, this is, at least, for, as I say, a firm the size of JPMorgan, it's a paradigm shift. And changing someone's regulatory reporting platform end-to-end is no small feat. But over time, I think the things we're going to see evolve are the skill sets that are required in regulatory roles. I think operations and technology are going to get closer together in terms of the skill sets required in either role, which I guess if you've used Rosetta would make more sense. But with CDM, understanding things like data cardinality or how to navigate through the Rosetta platform, those are things we found the traditional operations staff were a bit hesitant about. But as I say, this is just going to be an evolution over time of different skill sets that will evolve into these roles and the way they look at data and state management. Now, in terms of delivery, so I talked about operations. So the technology side of things, this is vastly simplified, but I think where we're at the moment is we're about to go live with ASIC and mass in 19 days. The real value for us with CDM and DRR will be the next jurisdiction that we build. The reason being, obviously, the first time we're building everything out, there's a huge, well, not huge, but there's a significant enough technology investment to be able to support CDM, DRR in your flow. Depending on your firm's adopting of open source code, there might be some hurdles to go through there to get external code into your firm. We've adopted public cloud as part of this solution, which had its own hurdles. But once this is live and once it's done, the real value is the next jurisdiction that comes along, because it won't be starting from scratch with a clean sheet of paper. It'll be, we've got a working CDM for all asset classes with all products and all events, and we're just plugging in another jurisdiction, so it should just be delta work between the two. And we're already actually prod parallel testing ESMA and FCA in the background alongside ASIC and mass as well, so we're seeing some of that now. And I think as we get all of the jurisdictions on, MIFIR eventually I think might be one of the last, I guess, on the current roadmap, having everything all in one platform with one single UI to review all of that lineage, all of the rules in one place, will allow us to spend time on the things that come into that 3 pillars that I talked about earlier. Because those 3 pillars, we always strive for them, but actually the one thing we never get a chance to achieve is the control one. Because in order to get that proactive control, you need to be investing. You need to be not spending 90% of your time fixing issues that are being found by other people, by running around doing or answering to regulatory queries that take way too long to answer. If you've got this stability, you can then start to invest in things like AI, ML, if that is how you want to do your anomaly detection, or preemptive control, or whatever else. So you can get in control of your own reporting instead of vice versa. But ultimately, yeah, the main benefits here are you'd only need to, if you wanted to build or go from scratch and you haven't got CDM, DRR, the main work you've got to do is your CDM work, like modeling your risk management systems to CDM. There's a wealth of resource out there to help with that, and forums as well. The CDM and DRR is created and maintained by industry experts, so you'll find a lot of the work is already done. We're actually implementing 4 asset classes: credit, rates, equities, FX. We haven't found any significant gaps in CDM at all. We've been able to model all of our products to the extent required by the regulator, which has been fantastic. And obviously, the longer, now if you were to start using DRR, you've got 4 or 5 jurisdictions already available, soon to be obviously the 5. So yeah, it's fantastic. Like for us, I've got no vested interest in selling it. But it has been a real paradigm shift internally, and we're looking to expand across markets, not just in our line of business now, because it will dramatically lower the cost of compliance for us in 19 days. So in terms of, sorry, I'm overrunning a bit. In terms of sort of what you might run into internally is if you're proposing a brand new end-to-end data model or state management model, you might already get asked the question of, does that mean we have to maintain CDM alongside an existing internal model? Well, yes, the chances are you do. But there's a lot of value around that, because I think, speaking personally, there's various other regulatory flows in the firm. It's not all about sending data outbound. You might have downstream feeds to, say, corporate technology that has regulatory data in it, which they then use to do, say, liquidity reporting. Now, those downstream feeds will always need to exist in a firm. But if you could remove the regulatory data from those, then usually those feeds are the kind of feeds you don't touch, and then they just work, right? But if you've got regulatory data inside those feeds, it's going to be a source of volatility and regression impact. If you can take that regulatory data out and have it only in your CDM, DRR world, you're going to make those internal feeds a lot more stable, which is what we're seeing. Everything's already built with CDM, so it's not about what you've got to do that's extra. It's about what you don't have to do. The projection, the validations, the validations and the qualifications I haven't actually gone into, but that's the fantastic part of CDM. It's almost like a self-test of your own modeling. So as you're modeling your products, it will give you feedback and qualify those products and events to say what it thinks they are. And it will also validate in a way which is extremely useful. Like you try and build a vanilla option, it will physically tell you if something doesn't make sense from a contextual perspective. And they're clever contextual rules. They're not like, oh, strike is mandatory. It will look around the product at the payoff and understand, oh, you can't have a certain type of compounding if you have this on your interest rate leg, etc. So we were very impressed by some of that stuff, because that's the stuff that will just go under the radar on any other solution. So in terms of, does the CDM offer everything you need? Yes was the answer to us. I think we've made a few contributions that were minor, but it depends what you're going to use it for. If you happen to have the same scope as us and the same desires to use it as us, then it already has what you need. But ultimately, it's an open source solution. It's there to be extended. It's there to be extended for, either you could extend it personally in-house in your own version, or you can contribute back to the industry. But ultimately, this is an evolving platform over time. And in terms of how much time will be saved, those are all the things you don't have to do. But ultimately, we're looking at a completely different world internally once this is live. It potentially quite volatile at first, with the way things work and everything else. But longer term, it feels like we're part of a bigger solution at industry level now, rather than just doing our own regulatory reporting. There's definitely that feeling of support. Support's maybe the wrong word, but it feels like you're part of a bigger group of people who all have the same problem, but working together to solve it. And then if you were starting your CDM DRR journey, the next steps would obviously join the working groups. I think Eleanor gave you some details on the governance. Identify a jurisdiction that you wish to start with, whether it's a POC, maybe you want to go the lower volume one, or if you want to go big bang, depending on how much time you've got. And then decide on your implementation path. There's various flavors on the technical level you can go into with CDM, how you create CDM. Fully native, do you save the object? Is it transient? Do you use the Java version? Do you use the Python version or the Scala version, I think? And then, how do you set yourselves up internally to contribute back? That's where we're at the moment, is forming a capability around CDM and DRR. So not only are we using it, but we create governance and best practices within the firm, and potentially become an official maintainer longer term and contribute back. And then you execute UAT and go live, which is what we're going to do in 19 days. So, if you're a larger firm, obviously that could be a multi-year plan, or it could be much smaller. It depends how many of these regimes you're exposed to. But yeah, in terms of this sort of closing point, is really that bottom line. So the CDM, it really is it's a disruptive technology, which is not something, it's a buzzword that you can get to use in many industries except for regulatory reporting. But it really is a disruptive technology. And it honestly has the potential to change the way we do business longer term, especially from business to client and business to venue, et cetera. It just so happens that regulatory reporting is the thing that will get it into the minds of people now.
So before we get started, Nick and I have spoken for the last few years about CDM. And I remember the first call, when I explained the ideas to him, he got it like that. And he said, we're going to do this. And I'm amazed that he's up on stage saying, JPMorgan are implementing CDM, all asset classes and events. And not only that, the 24th of October is my birthday. So it's unbelievable. Okay, moving on. We're going to talk about a sort of a variation on the digital reg reporting theme. Open source reg reporting. We have taken the DRR code and implemented it in a cloud implementation, so we're going to talk about that. Firstly, though, I'm going to be joined by Stephen Sui from Royal Bank of Canada, who's going to talk about the context in which the project we've run over the last few months sits. So, Stephen, if you want to take the stage. There we go.
Hey, thank you so much, Jane, to give me this introduction. For the next 10 minutes, I'm going to give some overview for this open source regulatory reporting from FINOS. Okay, good. From this diagram, you can see the vision for FINOS on this open reg tech is very clear, compared with this traditional model on the top. And FINOS is implementing a standard implementations using these open collaborations with different industry participants and tech partners using open source. I can say it is revolutionary. Just like Nick said, right? It will introduce huge cost savings, and plus some reduce the complexity, and also reduce this the risk for each financial institutions involved with the regular reporting. So early this year, FINOS has launched this ORR project, and partnered with these listed participants from both banking and the tech sectors, try to simplify the digital regulatory kind of reporting implementation, and to define, develop this open source pilot. So RBC actually is the main sponsor for these initiatives, and has contributed to some of the business objectives and goals based on feedback from business user case. The main object of this, this pilot is to define a working method to produce a regulatory report, like auditable regulatory report, right, using open source on the cloud. So definitely, it will take advantage of CDM and DRR, and since it will provide this, English language guideline for this reg text, and this the open data dictionary, common data dictionary, so to bridge the gap on this, on the complex model understanding. So it's also going to follow BCBS 239, which is a principle for this effective risk aggregation and risk reporting. So the multiple data control points on this data ownership and data quality will be in place. So what's the goal for this pilot? Actually, with the right access for this relevant data set, the goal is to produce a product, right, which is ready to use, easy to deploy, right, associated with this synchronized data transformation capability from this local trade model into CDM and use DRR to generate report. So it can help these companies to meet all these CDE-driven data control obligations, for example, like standard data qualifications and data completeness. And if time allows, definitely, we're going to try these AI initiatives on this, regulatory rule and executable code generations from English language risk regulatory requirement text. So if there's any gap identified, we definitely will prioritize to act on it. So overall, the ultimate success criteria for this pilot is to provide the end-to-end traceabilities, data traceabilities, and provide proof of English language translations using into that executable code using that FINOS open source tool. All right, and you can see this goal is very, very ambitious. So the project team has decided to take this phased approach. So we start from something is simple. So you can see from these slides, there's 3 different phases have been defined. Before I dive into it, I would like to spend a few minutes to give some introduction on the tool we selected for these phase 1 implementations. The first is Room. Room is the open source product derived by Rosetta and developed by one of the company called Regnosis. Similar to Rosetta, Room has 2 different components. The first is code generator. The second is DSL language, which could be used to represent these data structures and domain logic in a more technology and system agnostic way. And the most important application of Room is for the regulatory data generation. So actually, Regnosis and ISDA have been working very closely on this CDM DRR implementations for the past few years. Since this pilot is cloud-based, and we choose Databricks, and it's not just because it has lots of open source features, but also it has the capability to help to handle the large data volume, and also have tools like a unit catalog to have these data governance features like data lineage and data control. Also, on top of it, it provides these exciting GI features help us to tackle this rule generation or code generation goals. All right, back to phase 1. The scope for phase 1 basically just focus on this Room and Databricks integration. Just for the past few weeks, the Regnosis team have been working very hard with Databricks to to work on this integration effort, right? And just recently, the working environment has been set up on the FINOS lab environment, and which is it's going to take this CDM trait and run against the Room DRR Java code, and will produce different regulatory report along with this ISO 20022 XML output. Yeah, and later on, you will give some detailed information on this phase 1 implementation. Back to phase 2, actually, the focus is try to fill the gap within this end-to-end data pipeline, actually. And so there were several working items involved. And the first one is translation from FML to CDM. And this is very critical. If without it, we cannot adopt the DRR. So fortunately, Regnosis is working on this open source solutions, right, to do this data transformation. And hopefully, in the near future, this could be released for the public use. And the second, we're going to use RegDelta to do some pre-processing of the regulated text for this rule generation, and later on to run this open, like Gen AI, to generate rules and code. And we have to allocate sometimes, unfortunately, and to look at this rule and DRR code to enhance the performance. And the last and the most important, and we have to make sure the data lineage and the data control is in place for each step of the process. So until all this is completed, so as part of phase 1, RBC has committed to take this code and install this our own cloud environment and run against large data, like a large trade volume, and to see how it performed and provide feedback to the FINOS open source community. Just recently, I was told, and the Bank of Montreal is also going to do this like a test. Okay, it's very good news. All right, and come to these slides. It's just give you it's more visual way to help us to understand this end-to-end data flow architecture. So you can see on the item in blue, which is already completed as part of phase 1, as I mentioned earlier, and the rest will be tackled on phase 2. There's two separate streams on this data flow architecture. The first one is just to provide using this FML trade data as the input and give this XML data as output. And the second stream is normally just about this regulatory text initiatives. And somehow just to take some regulatory text and run some gen model to generate these regulatory rules and convert into code and run against some of the CDM trades and generate some reports. And you can see all this process item is running against the Databricks platform. And hopefully in the future, we may also look at this Red Hat OpenShift to run to see how it works. All right, this concludes all my slides. And I turn over to Ian for this phase 1 implementation details.
OK, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. So yeah, thanks to RBC and Bank of Montreal for their sponsorship of this phase 1 work. And anyone can get involved. And as you're going to see, it's actually quite easy to run what we've done. So let me talk about this. So the outcomes, I'm going to start with the outcomes of what we achieved in phase 1. So we've effectively taken DRR and CDM. So we have an implementation, which we're calling sort of open source regulatory reporting implementation, available on the cloud for anyone to replicate. Trying to speak to the business users is always important. So business intelligence, being able to track your performance of your reporting, that's delivered off the shelf on a par with regulatory reporting systems. Well, on a par, maybe I'm being a bit mean to the vendors. But we'll see what we were able to come up with really off the shelf. And then there's opportunity for varied and multiple independent experiments with DRR now. So people can take this, use Databricks, use their own Apache Spark implementation, and throw lots of data at it and see what comes out. And actually, this afternoon, we're talking about CDM and AI. There's some guys working on AI rule writing and stuff. It's all sort of coming at in different directions. But some of the things we talk about as kind of aspirational goals are really happening. OK, this was the original business perspective we were aiming at. So show DRR and CDM can be natively run on the cloud technology. Show CDM trade event inputs changing and observe the equivalent ISO 20022 regulatory reports being generated, tested against the trade repository or regulator validation rules, and the outcomes being persisted and stored in a database or a warehouse. How are we going to do it? Implement the DRR running out of the box using existing open source tools, technologies, and libraries. We didn't change anything on DRR, didn't do anything to CDM. Why? Address senior business leaders, what used to be called management information requirements, business intelligence requirements. Can I see statistics on trades processed, reports sent, how many rejected by the trade repository? And then the next one was sort of that regulatory query idea that Nick was talking about. Show me the life cycle of these trades, what were the equivalent reports that were generated from them. We didn't quite do that, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Demonstrates the DRR and CDM out-of-the-box implementation on cloud technology that can be replicated by anyone. So that's really what the greatest success was. I think Jane was calling it CDM in a box, or is there, DRR in a box was what was the guiding principle. Okay, on the technology side, CDM is open source. DRR for each regulation is available for use out of the box, open access. Rune is open source and available for use out of the box. Databricks is open source elements, which we use just the basic implementation, and again, what we were aiming to do. So here's an architecture diagram that's very high level, but has been validated and is correct. So effectively, we're taking all the CDM test trades available that we could find in the public domain. We get the DRR code. We build it into a jar, and then we drop it into to run on Apache Spark. We load the data into Delta Lake within Databricks, and then we just run the code and see what comes out. And we got a presentation layer then using the Databricks UI. So let me show you what the outcome was. So this is effectively the dashboard we got, and with very little work, showing the performance of our sample data for reporting. Now the percentages there show the performance of the reporting against the validation rules. They're pretty low. I'd say Nick would be very worried about those numbers. But that's to do with the sample data we loaded, which is really just all the CDM sample data that's out there. Some of it's based on really old FPML examples. But yeah, we've shown that if you adjust it, that you can get better statistics out. Now a little bit more on the structure of this. So effectively, you can't really see that, but it's not really too important. The process there, that flow diagram essentially starts off with loading the data. So we basically load the data and create a table, which is our loaded trades. And then the next column is where we generate the reports. So we create a report table for each jurisdiction. So there's all the different jurisdictions that were on Eleanor's slides that ISDA has published DRR code for. So effectively, this is each report or each regime. And then we have the validation of those reports against the validation rules, which are also provided, which have also been coded up into DRR, which can be something as simple as checking it's the right data format, it's a decimal when it's supposed to be, or something more complex. Then we convert the trade, again using the code available, projected from a report in effectively CDM. We project it to ISO 20022, which is the XML format required by the trade repositories to get it into the trade repository. And then finally, there's another validation of the XML, because with the XML schemas, there's a validation, XML validation. So effectively, we've gone from trade all the way to the trade repository. You could send those XML files to DCC and they'd be accepted. Well, 95% of them would. And then on the right-hand side, these are just the steps being run This is sort of the UI of Databricks. It's not optimized. The code wasn't really optimized. It took about 5 minutes to run all these. But again, it's 185 trades running against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 reports, and then the various processes. So it takes a bit of time, but it hasn't been optimized at all. And Josh from Databricks is here. He could probably do it in about 10 minutes, make it much more dynamic and powerful. Okay, this is what we were able to see. You can get in there and see the tables of sample data. This is the Par 45 report. You can scroll across, and there's a row for each data field. A column for each data field. Each row is effectively a trade report. Now, so the pictures are really to show you that it is real. Some of the outcomes which are also worth noting is, and I've mentioned it, optimization wasn't addressed. We'd need to work on that. Test trades were drawn from DRR and CDM libraries. We need an improved library of test trades out in the open, but some of the data from real institutions has been tested against it, and the performance is where it should be. So, you know, we want to hear people implementing this, throwing loads of data at it, and see how it performs. And we didn't really have because of the way we collected all the trade samples, we didn't have necessarily the realistic life cycle of one transaction or many transactions where a trade is created, it gets novated, it gets increased, it gets decreased, and then it fully terms. So we didn't really get to see that state transition at the trade level, but we could have, and it would have performed, it would have been a good experiment, but we'd like to see that too. So we just need more test data, I'd say. So the benefits of DRR have been mentioned, and you know, that mutualized industry regulatory reporting solution, that being part of a community, you know, Nick said it, that warm feeling of comfort, that's really important. It's open access to code that's transparent. You can point the regulators to it and tell them to go and have a look if there's a problem. So ORR, why have we done this? What's the benefits of this? So we've made it easy for people to pick up DRR and implement it. You can go and experiment with DRR and test it on internal data, or expand the work we've done on the pilot. We have our own plans to expand it, as Stephen showed us. But really, the question is, the last one with the smiley face, if you're in a financial institution, you got regulatory reporting obligations, just go and take this thing and use it. Scan that, go to that repo, read the README file, follow the steps, and you can make this work yourself. Now, I have an admission to make. I studied engineering. I'm a computer and electronic engineer, but I failed programming in first year, right? Java programming. And I got this to work, so anyone can do it, right? So get stuck in, go to the README file, and we want to hear all the good and the bad of how it worked. So thank you to Stephen and Eleanor and Nick for joining me today. And any questions? It's all clear. Great.
The versions of DRR and CDM, are they implemented?
They were the latest ones. So there's partial, the ASIC reports and stuff will all be changing, I would hope, as we go. Yeah. Any other questions? Does everyone know what they've got to do? Okay. Thank you very much.